So microbial stability in this context is a wine's resistance to spoilage by yeast or bacteria post-fermentation. So a stable wine will not spontaneously re-ferment, will not develop excess volatile acidity or aromas such as Brett-related aromas, will not undergo unintended or prolonged malolactic fermentation, or will not develop a haze that is distinct from a protein or cold instability related haze. From an industry perspective, stability matters because once a wine is bottled, the opportunity to intervene is essentially gone. Bottling is the final control point where microbial populations, chemical protection, and physical clarity can be assessed and intentionally managed. After bottling, wine will enter your tasting room as well as any retail locations, and it's largely outside of your control. So it's important to view this point as a control point and assess your wine stability at this time. Spring represents a natural decision point in the winery year and is one of the most important times to step back and assess your wine's stability. By this point, most of your wines have finished primary fermentation and been settled and clarified and completed malolactic fermentation if they've undergone that. In other words, your wines are no longer evolving rapidly, which makes stability risks much easier to evaluate. At the same time, seasonal warming begins to stress test your wines. So as cellar temperatures fluctuate, any existing instability can become amplified. Wines that are not fully finished or adequately protected may show renewed microbial activity, increased oxygen reactivity, or faster sulfur dioxide consumption. Rising temperatures can also shorten your safe storage windows. So microbial metabolism accelerates under warmer conditions, meaning a wine that may appear stable during cold winter storage may longer be stable as spring progresses. This is also the time when your bottling schedules are finalized and decisions about filtration, your SO2 targets, any other antimicrobial tools that are used, as well as bottling logistics are actively being made. So this is the last practical opportunity to confirm that your wines are ready for bottling. Some of these adjustments can still be made, which makes this the ideal time to do this. You can adjust your SO2 according to adjusting it to molecular levels based on your pH, as well as any blending to make sure wines are as stable as possible. So what can go wrong in the bottle? An unstable wine may show several different things. As most of us know, the combination of alcohol and pH in wine typically creates a harsh environment where most bacteria cannot survive. So only a small group of specialized bacteria can grow. In dry wines, the risk is relatively low because there's little to no remaining sugar and nutrients available. But wines that contain residual sugar are much more vulnerable. So what happens when it occurs? Wines can show a range of clear warning signs for spoilage. One of the most serious is re-fermentation. This can cause a pressure buildup in your bottle and even an explosion in extreme cases. Wines may also develop a microbial haze that is distinct from protein or cold instability haze. Sensory indicators are common as well, depending on which microbe proliferates, and these can include off-aroma production and elevated volatile acidity. In some cases, wines may become unintentionally spritzy due to CO2 production, and this is another strong indicator of ongoing microbial activity. All of these issues can negatively impact your wine quality and ultimately damage your brand's reputation if they are not prevented or properly managed. Wines should ideally be made intentionally stable prior to bottling to ensure consistency, quality, and a positive brand reputation, which is especially important in 2026. So first I will be discussing different yeast risks that are present. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, as we all know, is the yeast that's responsible for making wine. If there's any of them left in the wine, it's capable of fermenting if residual sugar remains and the wine is left unfiltered. Favorable conditions for this to occur are if the primary fermentation was sluggish or stuck. SO2 levels are really low or diminished over time, and temperature increases can also play a part in this. Even a small amount of residual sugar can be enough for this to occur. Another yeast that's responsible for spoilage is Brettanomyces, which is a non-sac yeast that we generally consider a spoilage organism in most wine styles. Volatile phenols that are associated with Brett are typically described as horsey, barnyard, band-aid, medicinal, etc. And most of the time, these are not considered desirable. And especially in most modern and clean wine programs. It's important to remember that Brett is not the only organism that's capable of producing compounds like these, and certain lactic acid bacteria can also produce volatile phenols. So if you're worried about a Brett infection, confirm it through lab testing and understanding your wine's history before you jump to any major conclusions there. Brett tends to proliferate under specific conditions, which again, residual sugar, which provides a good food source. Seasonal cellar warming can be a particularly risky time because wines that were previously stable can become more vulnerable if SO2 management and oxygen control aren't tight, and these yeasts can grow. So some of the bacteria that are responsible for microbial instability in wine are those that are colloquially referred to as lactic acid bacteria. These become a stability concern when malolactic fermentation is incomplete or begins to drift after it is thought to be finished. From a microbial control standpoint, any detectable malic acid should be treated as a potential substrate for continued LAB activity. The Australian Wine Research Institute considers microbial stability in terms of malic acid concentrations. Malic acid should be below 0.05 grams per liter to be considered microbially stable. This is particularly in wines that will not be bottled with sterile filtration, which we highly advise against not filtering your wines. Uncontrolled lactic acid bacteria activity are also associated with the formation of biogenic amines. These are more likely to accumulate in wines with a pH above 3.6 and under warmer storage conditions. They're not acutely dangerous and are found in almost every fermented food, including cheese and cured meats, but some individuals do have a sensitivity to them. And there's no regulatory limits currently established in the US for their amounts in wine. Diacetyl can also be an effect of lactic acid bacteria in your wines. Low diacetyl levels are stylistically acceptable for wines such as Chardonnay, but I don't think that we typically see much diacetyl in the Midwest cold hardy varietals. So if this becomes an issue and if your wines taste buttery, this is a clear indicator that you have some lactic acid bacteria in your wines. Acetic acid bacteria present a separate risk. Their growth is oxygen dependent, And so when oxygen is present, these organisms can oxidize ethanol into acetic acid, which leads to increases in volatile acidity. And this becomes even more of a pronounced issue with warmer temperatures and in wines with inadequate SO2 protection. So here's kind of a helpful flow chart of microbial spoilage. It occurs when microbes survive, grow, and metabolize substrates in your wines, leading to chemical, physical, and sensory faults. This is highly dependent on the wine's environment. And so any residual sugars that are left over in your wines, as well as other nutrients, and then higher pH, intermingled with a low SO2 amount, and you're creating an environment that can allow microbes to grow and proliferate. And this is dependent on the yeast or bacteria being present, obviously, which again, as previously discussed, there's certain ones that are tolerant of the alcohol content as well as acidity that's present in wine. Once they grow and through metabolizing the sugars, acids, and ethanol present in the wine, they create chemical and physical changes such as carbon dioxide production, different acids being formed, as well as different off-aroma compounds, haze, and leading to overall instability as well as wine faults being present in your wines, which is obviously something that we do not want. Temperature plays a critical role in this. While wines may appear stable under cool storage conditions, temperature increases can stimulate dormant or slow-growing microorganisms. As temperatures rise, microbial metabolism accelerates. So yeasts or bacteria that are capable of surviving in wine can more rapidly consume residual sugars or other substrates. Warmer temperatures can therefore intensify spoilage mechanisms like re-fermentation, CO2 production, VA formation, and the development of off aromas. Repeated warming and cooling cycles can reduce the effectiveness of your SO2 and allow microbes multiple opportunities to become active. And I want to stress the point that even a microbiologically stable wine can become unstable if temperature is not properly controlled. So some of the risk factors of this occurring, obviously, as mentioned, the wine's composition is a primary driver of microbial stability or instability. And I like to consider microbial stability the combined effect of the wine's chemistry interacting with the other factors at play, such as temperature. Residual sugar is one of the most influential components of this. Even very small amounts of fermentable sugar can provide a food source for yeast and bacteria to grow. Industry guidance, such as from groups such as the Australian Wine Research Institute, emphasizes that any measurable glucose or fructose can support microbial growth. And they suggest that any residual sugar below or above 0.1 grams per liter can cause your wines to become microbially unstable. Minimal filtration and clarification are becoming somewhat popular in certain segments of the industry, but filtration remains one of the most crucial tools for ensuring microbial stability once your wine is bottled. The risk associated with bottling an unfiltered wine, particularly the risk of spoilage, re-fermentation, and sensory defects, far outweighs the perceived risk of losing a positive aroma or flavor through filtration. And most research and industry experience shows that properly executed filtration does not influence the amount of aroma compounds present in your wines. What it does do is significantly reduce the risk of instability once your wines leave your winery. Microbial risk is closely tied to how your wines are handled prior to bottling. One of the first considerations is your malolactic fermentation, if used, and its completeness, as well as long-term stability. Wines that have not fully completed MLF can retain active lactic acid bacteria that remain active during tank storage. Another risk factor is your wine's oxygen exposure during routine handling. This includes when wines are transferred, pumped over, or prior to bottling, any preparation involved there. Oxygen pickup can stimulate microbial growth and accelerate some of these spoilage reactions. Temperature management during transfers is also important. Moving cold wine into a warmer environment can increase dissolved oxygen uptake. So allowing wines to warm before transfer helps reduce oxygen solubility and limits that unintended exposure to oxygen. Sanitation remains a foundational concept of winemaking, and thus any poorly cleaned fillers or bottles can introduce spoilage organisms directly into an otherwise stable wine. Even brief contact times are enough to reintroduce microbial risk if sanitation lapses occur. Finally, extended tank time before bottling increases exposure to all these risks. And the longer a wine remains in bulk storage, the more opportunities there are for oxygen ingress, microbial survival, and chemical changes to your wines. So I wanted to expand upon oxidation because this is one of those critical factors that ties many of these cellar and microbial risks together that we've already discussed. As temperatures warm, especially, oxygen becomes more reactive in wine, and so the impact of even small oxygen pickups can be magnified. Routine cellar operations are where most oxygen exposure occurs, and these include when wines are transferred, blended, filtered, or bottled, and particularly if hoses and pumps are not properly purged or tanks are not adequately blanketed with an inert gas. Oxygen may be pulled directly into the stream if hoses are not purged with an inert gas, such as nitrogen, and this includes increasing the dissolved oxygen present in your wine prior to bottling. So this is why many larger wineries use a DO meter throughout bottling to ensure that their wine's DO levels remain below 0.5 parts per million. Temperature also plays an important role here because cold wine holds more dissolved oxygen. So transferring wines while they're cold can result in higher oxygen uptake. Reducing this risk involves allowing your wines to warm slightly before any transfers. From a microbial standpoint, oxygen directly supports acetic acid bacteria growth. As oxygen availability increases, so does the risk of increased volatile acidity, especially under warmer conditions. Oxidation also affects SO2. After a transfer with excess oxygen pickup, free SO2 can drop rapidly as it's bound and consumed. A wine that tested adequately protected before movement but may fall below its target molecular SO2 level shortly after a transfer, reducing microbial protection of your wine. So here's a brief overview of some analytical testing methods that are used to understand your wine's risk. Common approaches to analytical testing include traditional plate counts, as well as PCR-based methods and microscopy. Each of these provide different information about the microbes that are present in your wines. I'd like to mention that these are useful for troubleshooting rather than routine screening, and all microbial tests have detection limits. So a non-detect result does not guarantee sterility or long-term stability of your wine. Microscopy can reveal total cell presence, including non-culturable organisms, but it doesn't distinguish between active and inactive populations. And a positive PCR result indicates presence, but not necessarily active growth. Because of these factors, microbial testing should always be used alongside chemical indicators. Residual sugar provides a direct assessment of fermentable sugars in your wine. Malic acid confirmation is critical for verifying that MLF is complete. Free and molecular SO2, when evaluated relative to pH, can provide insight into the antimicrobial protection that your wine has. pH and VA trends also can indicate conditions that favor microbial growth or ongoing activity. Taken together, these testing methods can help inform risk, but they don't replace good process control. And so stability is best assessed by combining these with sound cellar practices and good wine chemistry as well. So there are some stability tests that can be used to help assess a risk that a wine has. Forced fermentation trials are one practical approach to this. These are where wines are held under warmer conditions to determine whether residual yeast or bacteria can restart activity when conditions become favorable. PCR may also be useful at this stage, particularly to detect low-level populations of spoilage organisms, but it doesn't detect activity as mentioned previously. So a positive result indicates only its presence. MLF monitoring remains foundational. So this involves confirming that your malic acid is depleted and stable over time. Incomplete or drifting MLF represents one of the more common sources of post-bottling instability. Heat or storage challenge testing can help provide an insight by simulating temperature conditions that wines may encounter during distribution and beyond once you're no longer in control of them. And again, none of these tests guarantee stability, but they do indicate whether or not there's a risk present, which there always is a little bit of a risk, but they indicate whether or not your wines are stable or not. And as always, the Midwest Grape and Wine Industry Institute is available for any support with this. Some control strategies exist to ensure that your wines remain microbially stable, especially right before bottling. The most important, arguably, one of the most important tools for preventing microbial instability is SO2 management. As cellar temperatures rise and fluctuate, this becomes especially important. Understanding that effective SO2 protection depends not just on the amount added, but on achieving the correct molecular SO2 target based on wine pH and intended style is key. At a higher pH, a much smaller fraction of free SO2 exists in the molecular form. This means that wines with an elevated pH require higher free SO2 levels to achieve the same antimicrobial protection, particularly as warmer temperatures increase microbial metabolic activity. SO2 additions should also be made promptly after confirming MLF is completed and reassessed multiple times, especially as wines approach bottling. Sorry, but this is especially important during spring when these temperatures are fluctuating. Warming conditions can accelerate SO2 binding and then also, again, microbial growth, narrowing your margin of safety. So always ensure that you're managing your SO2 proactively rather than reactively, and monitor your free SO2 regularly. Remember that the TTB establishes an upper limit of 350 parts per million total SO2 in finished wines. This is well beyond the levels that I typically see used in most wineries. And again, this is one of the most effective tools available for controlling microbial activity. So, you make sure to use it and manage it appropriately, manage the concentration relative to wine's pH. Filtration is also one of the most important things to use to ensure microbial stability in your wines. So sterile filtration is designed to physically remove microorganisms capable of growth in the bottle. And nominal reduces microbial load. So we always recommend sterile filtering at 0.45 microns or smaller to achieve true microbial stability, as a larger pore size than that may allow bacteria to pass through. We also recommend bubble point testing to ensure that your filter is sound. This verifies that the membrane is intact and performing as expected before filtration. More information on this is available on our website as well as YouTube channel. Erin just wrote up an excellent article on filters, different types of filters, as well as bubble point testing. So in addition to SO2 and filtration, there are several additional antimicrobial tools that we can use strategically to manage microbial risk. These are not good substitutes for process control, but they can be effective when used appropriately. Potassium sorbate is one option for inhibiting yeast growth, particularly in wines with residual sugar. But be sure to use this only when malolactic bacteria are fully absent. If they're still present post-MLF, sorbate can be metabolized and lead to geranium taint, which is a significant sensory defect. And so confirming your MLF is completed is essential before its use. Other antimicrobials, such as lysozyme or DMDC, may be appropriate in specific situations. Lysozyme can be useful for managing lactic acid bacteria. DMDC is commonly applied at bottling to control yeast in wines with residual sugar. These are most effective when used as part of a broader stability strategy rather as corrective measures. And they both have TTB approved limits to their use. Blending can also be an effective risk management approach. Blend higher risk wines with more stable lots to help reduce the overall residual sugar, raise your alcohol concentration, or improve the effectiveness of sulfur dioxide, thereby lowering any microbial risk, or most microbial risk. These tools are most successful when they're used intentionally with a clear understanding of your wine's chemistry, as well as microbial status and your bottling goals. Another one that is important, extremely important, is verifying your sanitation procedures prior to bottling through the use of tools such as ATP meters, test strips to confirm bottling line sterility. Making sure that there isn't a delay between filtration and bottling is also an important step. Failures often occur after successful filtration due to unclean hoses, fillers, gaskets, or even bottles. So make sure your standard operating procedures for sanitation are strong, sound, and validated. So with all that said, what goes into the bottle? When a wine is finished and ready for bottling, microbial stability should be well established and not something that we're just hoping that happens after the fact. Sterile filtration provides a physical barrier to yeast and bacteria, ensuring that microbial populations are removed or minimized before the wine even reaches the bottle. Again, bubble point test your sterile filter, which allows you to verify its performance. And we have an excellent lunch and learn on bubble point testing on our YouTube channel. Chemical protection is also equally important. Molecular SO2 should be intentionally adjusted based on your wine's pH and style. Malolactic fermentation, fully complete and stable where applicable. This means malic acid has been analytically confirmed to be below that 0.05 if you're trying to ensure that these bacteria do not reactivate. Oxygen management is very critical throughout the winemaking process, but especially so at bottling. DEO should be monitored throughout bottling to ensure that oxygen pickup is minimized and does not undermine SO2 protection or long-term stability. And we want to see that dissolved oxygen remain below 0.5 parts per million throughout. Residual sugar should be within the acceptable limits of the intended wine style and stabilization approach. And finally, again, bottling line sanitation must be confirmed. Make sure your fillers, lines, and bottles are clean and well sanitized. This ensures that microbial risk is not reintroduced after you've already filtered and can be confirmed through the use of an ATP meter or through stringent SOPs. When all of these elements come together, the result is a bottled wine that is stable, predictable, and protected as it enters your customer's hands. I've already mentioned these briefly, but a couple of examples of microbial instability in your bottle would be an increase in volatile acidity. This is strongly suggestive of acetic acid bacteria consuming the ethanol in your wine in the presence of DO. This is likely due to inadequate SO2 levels in your wine, poor hygiene, or improper storage conditions, likely a combination of the three. Excess headspace exposure during tank storage before bottling could factor as an issue that plays into this as well. Make sure your wines are sterile filtered and properly treated with SO2 to prevent this and almost all other microbial issues. Geranium taint is another fairly common indicator of microbial instability. This involves MLF bacteria consuming the potassium sorbate, sorbic acid, and this leads to them producing a compound that tastes or smells rather like geraniums and is really undesirable. And some people can detect this very, very well. And it's actually the sensory threshold for this is below around 100 parts per trillion. So even if a tiny bit of this compound is formed, it can ruin your wine. Okay, so some key takeaways to this discussion is that microbial stability is multifactorial. There's many things that come into play when you are discussing microbial stability, including the wine's chemistry, any yeast or bacteria present, any oxygen that the wine's been exposed to, your SO2 levels, etc. And pre-bottling decisions can determine the quality and the microbial stability of your wines. Make sure to combine your wine's chemistry with testing if desired, as well as process control, which is, throughout the process remains very important to ensuring wine's overall quality. When you're not sure, make sure to stabilize conservatively and target that 0.8 parts per million molecular SO2 in your wine. Control your hazards with a written bottling plan. And so this, again, can determine that your wines remain microbially stable post-bottling as they enter customers' hands. Okay, so now I'm going to open it up for questions as well as discussion. I wanted to mention briefly that Randall Voss is hosting a pruning workshop at Dosage Vineyard on March 5th. I think that Christy sent out an email yesterday stating that she'd like people to send her an email by yesterday, but I'm sure if you sent her one, she'd let you into that. And then I'd also wanted to mention that the Iowa Wine Growers Association conference is March 22nd and 23rd.